Hi. Okay.
I said the rabbi's
Um,
been
are we
always
ready to go?
on. We're ready to go.
Okay, great. So we were discussing.
Rabbi, before we start, so there's no Eretz Yisrael, and there's nothing going on in January, February as of now, right?
I don't have my phone with me at the moment, but
Okay,
I'll check. I don't think so. I may have some weddings, but I don't know if there are any on Tuesday nights.
okay, great.
I do have some weddings. I know for that for sure, but I'm not sure about Tuesday nights. As far as I know, we should be okay. And if
Okay,
not,
great.
then I will let you know as early as possible.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. So yeah, so we're discussing the Gemara. We should have the Marmakomos that begin with Makoros be'inan nemonus mocher ve'edechad Messiah. Does everybody have those proper Makoros?
Is that the
Wow, great echo. That's a master echo.
Everybody have the right Marmakomos? Yeah, I'm assuming the answer is yes. Okay. So let us begin. So we were discussing the Gemara again. We're jumping around a little bit. We're further than this, and also here at the same time. So this is the Gemara in Beis Amud Beis that we started discussing last week, and we're going to review for a minute, but then focus on the problem of Eidachon Messiah, which I will explain. So the Gemara here on Beis Amud Beis, after explaining that the Mishnah says Shnai Mos and Betalis, Zeomar Ani Mitzasia, Zeomar Ani Mitzasia, Zeomar Ani Mitzasia, Zeomar Kula Shali, Zeomar Kula Shali. We say Yachloku Bishvua. So the Gemara was troubled, as we discussed, by the seemingly superfluous dual language. Why does it say Ani Mitzasia and Kula Shali? So the Gemara explained that the case of the Mishnah, there are two different cases. One is a case of Mitzia. Mitzia is a case where um, basically the the somebody encounters an object which is hefker, let's say, and they pick it up and they want to acquire it. So there's a debate who picked it up first, right? Ruvain says I picked it up. Shimon says I picked it up. That's ani mitzasiya. What is kula shali? So the Gemara says it's a case of mekachomemkar. There was a previous owner. The mocher sold the object. There's a conflict as to who he sold it to. Did he sell it to Reuven or did he sell it to Shimon? Each one claims I was the recipient of this purchase, of this sale.
So that means that everybody says Kula Sheli.
Yeah, everybody's saying Kula Shali either way in the Mishnah. That's so Ze'anu Mitzasi is a case of a Mitzia, something that they found, and Ze'amar Kula Shali is a case where there was a previous owner who sold the object, and the question is to identify the purchaser. So, in context of that, the Gemara says here on Beis Amud Beis, Mekach Emkar. If one of the cases is Mekach Emkar, the Lechsi Zuzi Miman Nakat. Why don't we just follow, as I said last week, follow the money trail, see who the money came from? So, according to most Rishonim, this also means to ask the mocher who gave you the money, right? But the implication is that if you're going to ask the mocher, that's because he is believed. Now, why should the mocher be believed? After all, he's just an individual. This is dine mominus. This is a monetary dispute, and in a monetary dispute, you have to have two witnesses in order to prove your position. So, if the Gemara says "V'lexi zuzi mimanakat," why don't we ask him who he got the money from? The implication seems to be that we apply a special din of nemanus, a special credibility is given to the mocher. So either way, the Gemara, and I'll get back to this in a moment. The Gemara says, "Lo tzricha denaka mitravayu mechad midaiter mechad bal karche v'lo yadanu mihu midaiter umihu bal karche." So the Gemara's answer is, had it been so simple, namely that there was only one exchange of money, so then we would follow the money. We'd say, who did you get money from to the mocher? And, if he said it was Reuven, it was Reuven. If it's Shimon, it's Shimon. And that would end the conflict. The problem is that it's a little more complicated. Ruvain and Shimon, each one put money on the table. So the mocher only received one of them intentionally, with only wanted to sell to one of them, and therefore we don't trust him at this point to identify which one he wanted to sell to, and which one tried to force the money upon him, because it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, that's what the
Well,
Gemara says.
I'm sorry, man, but why don't we? In other words, he can choose who he wants to sell it to.
Correct.
So why don't we trust him? I'm sorry, I'm missing something.
So what we're saying is that either we don't trust that he remembers at this point because it's a little confusing, right? Or the situation is one, in which we don't reside that level of credibility in him as we did previously. Why would that be? So that we'll explain Rashi in just a second. So before we get to that, let me explain the bigger problem. So if you look at the Gemara in Kiddushin, we saw this last week, and the Tosefta in Bab Metzia, the biggest problem here, and this partially answers Jacob's query, is that the Tosefta and the Gemara in Kiddushin say that the special nemanus that we apply to a mocher, which, by the way, is paralleled, as we discussed last week also, by a chaya, a midwife, by a dayan, a judge. There's certain people who are in a unique position to know. We rely on them more, and also they have a greater responsibility and more specialized knowledge. So it sounds like the Gemara in Kiddushin and the Tosefta and Bab Metzia think that such individuals are given or accorded greater nemonis, greater credibility. But the Gemara says that applies only bisman shemikcho b'medvar mamur bisman shemikcho biyado. That's only true as long as the specialist, we'll call him, is in control of the situation. So, for example, in the case of mocher, he hasn't yet let the object of dispute has not left his possession. Or in the case of Achaya, the infants haven't left the hospital. Or in the case of a Dayan, the antagonists or the protagonists have not yet left the courtroom. So in all those cases, the Gemara says, the Tosefta says, or shalish, you have like a dispute, which revolves around a shomer, two people, or somebody gave an object to be watched, and it's in the hands of the shomer. We call him a shalish, a third party, let's say. So we believe the shalish about what's going on. But as soon as the shalish gives up the object, or the mocher, or the chaya, or the children, or the dayan, the people leave his courtroom. So the Tosefta actually says that at that point, there's no difference between these specialists, we'll call them, and any other person. Hare, this is the language of the Tosefta. Harehu kekol adam. So the problem is this. In the Gemara in Kiddushin and in the Tosefta, where this whole discussion takes place, it's fine. We could say that everything going on is going on while the object remains in the hands of the mocher. But the problem is, you can't say, it's hard to say that in our Gemara, in our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is Shnayim Ochazin Betalis. So it's already at the stage after the object left the possession of the mocher. So if the yichus of the mocher, his special status in Namonos, is tied to his position of power, right? And if the Mishnah is talking about a case of Shnayim Ochazin, which implies that it's after that is already terminated, so then the question is, why are we applying? Why do we care whether what the mocher says, if he's no longer in control? So we discussed this last week, so I'm just going to sum up what we're up to so we can move on. So the Rif came up with a very interesting.
In other words, the mocher was involved just because. In other words, the question assumes that the mocher has no credibility. I don't understand the question because
No. Remember, you're understating it. To begin with, it's a chiddush that the mocher has extra credibility, more than a regular person.
I disagree because the mocher is meaning he was the one who sold it, so he should have a lot of credibility.
Right, but in dine mominus, when there's a dispute between two people, you need evidence. It's not usually enough to just have nemanus. Nemanus is good enough for isurim, but
In Mammon, a buyer and a seller can't come together and say we sold it to each other. They'd have to
they
have.
can. But here that's not what happened here. Here you have two people each claiming to be the purchaser.
Correct.
So we want to know, why should we rely on the mocher?
Because the mocher was the one who sold it. I mean,
right, but he's still not the equivalent of two witnesses.
But actually, if anything, he's a nogea b'davar. He's maybe a problem.
Let's assume he's not a nogea b'davar because it doesn't make a difference to him. So let's eliminate that. But the point is, he's not two witnesses. In dine mominus, in matters of money,
someone owned a piece of land, and someone's there, or whatever, create a chazaka case. I mean, I think the person who had the land would have credibility to say who he sold it to. I'm not
if there's a dispute. If there's a dispute between two people,
yes,
who purchased, each one claiming I purchased the land, the other guy says I purchased the land.
I would think the guy who sold it would have the most credibility because he could say the truth who he sold.
Well, you're somewhat consistent with the Gemara, but it's not. What I'm trying to explain to you is that it's a chiddush. It's not. This is seems to be a break from the rules.
Okay.
The rules are that when it comes to matters of isurim,
yes,
meaning, is this is this piece of meat? Is this meat? One second. Is this meat chelav or shuman?
Right.
Or it's something like that. We say echad neman bisurim. We rely on a single individual. When it comes to matters of mammon or erva, we require two witnesses who are both objective, and that there are two of them. Anything less than two.
One point on objectivity, and that is that we have to remember that the guy that sold it, may very well have a reason he would have preferred to sell it to guy number two, even the guy number one gave him the money first.
But why is that a problem?
The rich man in town, whatever the reasons are. That's why
you're already
completely devoid of any relationship to the
right, but you're already getting into the question of, again, nogea b'davar of some sort.
No, but what I'm saying is witnesses normally, all I'm saying to Jacob is that if anything, one could take the opposite position by saying that he's not the typical neutral witness that we would have. I have nothing to do with no reason.
Well, you're saying it could be worse. And and it could also be that he's better or equal, but doesn't matter because one witness is never enough in matters of dine mammon. That's what I'm trying to say. The standard of dine mammon is if there's a dispute between people,
you need two, and one's not enough, and that's the problem.
Usually, correct.
Usually,
so it's an exception to the rule. That's what I'm trying to explain. When we say the chaya, the daya, and the mocher are believed, that is already somewhat of an exception because normally you would need two witnesses. Now, what's the basis? And we're going to get to that in just a second. So why do we believe that person? But at least it explains more, right? You started off your comment by saying it shouldn't matter whether or not he's holding on to it and is still in control. We should believe him because he sold him the object. He knows. So what I'm explaining is that even if he was holding on to the object, the halacha is that if he's holding on to the object, we believe it. But what I'm trying to explain is that is a chiddush. That is not obvious, and that is not according to the normal standards of evidence in a monetary dispute. There's a monetary dispute here between two people. Who's the real owner of this object?
But this is relying
Reuven and Shimon. Levi, the person who sold it, is so the Gemara is basically saying if Levi's still holding on to the object, we'll believe Levi, even though he's not, the gold standard of two witnesses, which normally we would require. However, if he gives up, if after the object is no longer in his domain, then that's what the words of the Tosefta mean. You'll appreciate it now more, hopefully. Harehu kikol adam, meaning he loses the special yichus of his nemanus.
Or an umdana.
And then he's back to being simply a neidachad.
Or an umdana.
I'm sorry?
Is this a svar or an umdana?
Which?
the fact that the guy, because I think we said last week, the Svara or whatever,
the fact that we believe him
the
when
busy guy behind the counter, the minute he lets go of it.
I mean, are you asking whether the svara, whether it's a svara that it's limited or it's a svara that it's expansive to begin with?
No, what I'm saying is that are we saying
to begin with that we believe
is
him?
basically a fact, so to speak. That,
what is?
That somebody behind the counter, okay, is only focused that second when he's making the transaction.
Well, again,
otherwise, I think that's what we said last week. Was one
that's Rashi. Well, that's what I'm trying to get. I'm just trying to sum up. But right, what I'm saying is just to give perspective, in Dine Mamanis, as opposed to Isurim, you typically require two witnesses. If any a situation where a monetary dispute is resolved without two witnesses is unusual, and then you have to explain what the basis of that is what I'm trying to explain. Now, what is the basis of that? So it's unclear. So let me give you three options, okay? So the Balitosis think that the Balitosis basically neutralized the whole concept that there are like specialists or people that we give extra nemonis or credibility to. Their position was as follows. It's undeniable. It's the Gemara in Kiddushin and the Tosefta and so on. So what they explained was, no, it looks like it's some new halacha. It's really just the din of migu. The din of migu is a din that boosts nemanus even in din imanis, meaning, why is it a din of migu? Because the mocher, can always say, I didn't sell it to anybody, right? They both put money down and I didn't sell it. And they did believe him because he's a muchs. He's also the muchsa.
What did that do for the mocher? He just lost the sale.
He can now sell it to whoever he wants going forward.
Yeah, but he wanted to sell it, okay?
No, but the point is that he's in the drivers.
Andy, maybe the price went up. The price went up, and he wants.
But we don't. Migus aren't maybe. If we have a migu, it basically.
We'll discuss the limitations of the migu in just a minute. But the bigger point for the moment is there is an institution called migu, which generally boosts the nemonus, and allows, a decisive win even in dine mamanis. And the Balitosa said all these dinim, chaya, dayan, mocher, they're all forms of migu in the sense that the person who's like, holding on to all the cards, if you will, that person, the person in the driver's seat, right? He could get his way no matter what. And therefore we believe him. That's based on the principle of migu. There's no special din of mocher and chaya and dayan. That's just a din of migu. That explains why it's limited to cases bisman in mocher, for example, bisman shemikha biyado. Because the second that he lets it go, he doesn't have control anymore. He's not the muchsa. We don't believe him anymore. That's called in Bava Basra. Tosas calls that in a different context. Ein omrim migu lemafreya, meaning, say, like an hour ago or a week ago, right? He could have done whatever he wanted, so we should believe him. Yeah, but that was a week ago, or that was an hour ago, or that was 10 minutes ago. He gave up his extra power. So since he gave up that, position of strength, there's no longer any migu. So that's the way Balitosis interpret Bameh Dvarim Amurim Bizman Shemikcho Biyado, Avo Kashe'ein Mikcho Biyado Harehu Kekol Adam, meaning he is powerful and seemingly breaks the rules that require two edim only when he has a migu. And when the migu is gone, because it's ein mikcho biyado, we don't believe him anymore because he's not in power anymore. Right? So that, right, Jacob? So that if the basis of the special nemanus, which allows you to bypass the need for two edim, is migu, it's totally understandable, but there are also not going to be any exceptions to the rule of Bamedvar Mamurim Bisman Shemikol Biyado. However,
we're saying that, I'm sorry, the migu is only applicable at the time that he still owns it, but once it's out of his possession, he loses the migu. Is that what Rabbi's saying?
yes, once he doesn't have possession, he can't. He's not in a position of strength anymore.
Why? I would argue he still has credibility because he.
It doesn't matter about his credibility anymore because migu is, or the credibility of migu is all contingent upon the moment when he makes his statement, and he doesn't have alternatives at the moment that he makes his statement if it's no longer biyado.
So once he loses migu,
it's like being,
all credibility.
It's like being a former president, while you're in the office, you have a lot of prerogatives, and the second that that you're out, you're out. So
that's why we have honorary.
But this migui,
right? But honorary presidents don't have the same power as the president or anybody.
We can talk about it later.
This migu is built upon some kind of understanding as to what anybody biyodo's capabilities are.
Yeah. So by the way, but I'll add another thing. So this is what Tosa says in Kiddushin. Tosa says in Kiddushin that the whole special stature of these three cases, which may imply like some new rule, is not a new rule at all. It's part of a broader rule known as migu. But there are two consequences Tosas has. One is it's not going to apply bisman she'ein mikol biyado, because that would be what I'm saying. He doesn't use this word, but I'm for using it. It would be the equivalent of migu l'mafreya. But there's another consequence, and that is if the only reason that we believe him when it's bisman she'mikol biyado is because of migu. Migu has some limits. For example, we have a rule that migu doesn't work keneged edim. Or to use the Aramaic, a migu b'mokom anansadi doesn't work. Anansadi means, that's the Aramaic, we are witnesses. So even if it's a very strong umdana, let's get back to Andy's point a second ago. Let's say there's a very, let's say on the one hand he has a migu, but the claim that he's making just doesn't, is not compelling to us at all. The opposite is compelling.
Statistically, it doesn't hold up.
Yeah. So listen, this is the case. This is what Tosa says. Tosa says, because again, Tosa has the same problem as the Rif, right? Which is, how can you talk in our Gemara about Bisman Shemikol Biyado if it's Shnayim Oxen Batalis? So Tosa says, no. In the Gemara in Kiddushin, it's Mikol Biyado. What is the Gemara talking about when it says, V'lech zizuzei miman nakad? So here it's very fascinating. This is what Tosa says. Tosa says, you follow the money, meaning how likely is it that even though he's claiming that he sold it to the other fellow, how likely is it that he sold it to the fellow that he didn't? He only received money from one person, but that's not the person he sold it to? Let's say he told that story. They mean only one person gave money. Reuven and Shimon each one claimed that he's the owner, right? But only one person gave money, Reuven. But let's say the Bisman Shemikol Biyado, and he has the migu, he's claiming, but I sold it, I intended to sell it to Shimon, even though I took the money from Reuven.
Well, then it's not a sale, because for a sale to take place...
No, forget about the sale. The sale part...
Das Mocher and Das Kona to be the same.
Either way, the money isn't the kinyan, probably, either way, because we paskin Dvar Torah Mosein on Kodas and Yid Mashiach. But the point is, there's something called a Mishapara.
Don't you need Das Kona and Das Mocher?
No, so what the Tosa says is, that's the pshat in the Gemara. When the Gemara says, V'lech zizuzei miman nakad, it means, even if he has a migu, if the claim that he makes is not credible, it's not convincing, we're not going to accept it because it's only a migu. So migu keneged anansadi doesn't work. So if he says, I sold it to Reuven, even though I got the money from Shimon, we don't believe him.
But it's not a question of believing him. It's not a sale.
No, it's not an issue of the sale. It's still
don't we need both parties to be cognizant when a sale is taking place?
Yes, we do.
If I'm going to sell something,
the question is, do we believe?
I have to know that I'm selling it to you. You have to know you're buying it from me.
Right. The Mocher just says,
If he took the money from the wrong guy, then clearly you don't have this mutual cognizance.
No, so the Reuven is saying, I bought the money from him for some reason. Now he wants to, he wants to favor Shimon. So the other guy says, listen, I can still keep it now if I want. It's all the worst I'll get is a Mishapara. But the Tosas says, let me read it inside, so you'll see it inside. This is what Tosas says. Look at Tosas Kiddushin Ein Gimel Amud Beis on page number 1. Skip down to past the Rashi. We'll talk about the Rashi in just a minute. Go down 5 lines. In the middle of the 5th line, the middle of the 5th line ends with the words Kach Shita Sakontras. Everybody have that? Tosas Kiddushin, page 1. So Tosas says, Umasha Pirish, the Parach Ain Mikhob Yoda de Kamar de Eno Neman, Uparach Nexi Zuzi Miman Nokat, Pirish Osa Shanosan Lamos, Vadai Desratze. He says, Kosha, de Mai Yesh Lanu Lamino Tvei Meirechad Bialma. According to Rashi, we'll soon see. Rashi says the case is a case of Shnai Moksim also, meaning that it's not Mikcho Biyado. So Tosa says, if it's not Mikcho Biyado, then he is no better than an Eid Echad Bialma, and that's not good enough for Dini Mamanis. The Kivin Shein Mikcho Biyado lo Shaykh Lomar Migu, that's what I was just explaining. Tosas thinks this is on the basis of Migu. Kedei Lahamino, meaning Tosas thinks the significance of Mocher Dayan Chaya is that they have a Migu. So then, but how does Rabbeinu, so how are they going to interpret the Gemara? Not Bab Metzia yet, but in Kiddushin. So the Gemara, then Tosas continues in Kiddushin. L'chein Pirush Rabbeinu Tam, Bizman Shemichel Biyado. You can't say that for Bab Metzia because it's Shnai Moks and Batalis. But in Kiddushin, we're talking about a case of Bizman Shemichel Biyado. The Mocher is still holding on. V'azu Neman Mitam Migu. Normally, we'd believe him because of his Migu. Dematzi Amar Lamacharti. He could say, I didn't sell to anybody. I didn't intend to sell to anybody. Or Chazarti V'kanisi, or I decided to retract the sale. He didn't really sell it because no one did a Mashicha. It's only a Misha, what's called a Misha Par. It's like a Klala. It's like an understanding that he should sell it to him, but he could, if he insists, he could still, the Kinyan wasn't done until there was a Mashicha, until it was taken from the Mocher. Aval ein mikcho biyado, but if he's not holding on to it, then eino neman to oslo shayich migu. So then, how do you explain the Gemara of Alexi Zuzi Miman Nakat? Why do we care where the money came from? We should only care, since it's Bizman Shemikcho Biyado, what the Mocher says. So Tosas explains, Uparich, Alexi Zuzi Miman Nakat, Nehi Nami de Mikcho Biyado, even if he's holding on, and even if he's claiming that he intended to sell it, or that he agreed to sell it to Ruvain, Amai Nemon, why would we believe him if he received the money from Shimon? Im Yomar Amisha lo kibel hamos lazen nisratetzi, is it credible to say that he intended to sell it dafka to the one who he didn't receive the money from? Demashma the Neman b'cholinyan. It sounds like the Mochers always believe, no matter what he says, whether he says Ruvain or Shimon, even if there's only one Matan Mos, and even if it's his claim is that he sold it to the non-Nosein Hamos. Vamai Neman, says Tosas, Have Migu b'makom edim, even if Migu is a strong reason to give extra credibility to the Mocher, right? But there are limits to the institution of Migu. We will never say Migu when it's very dissonant, when it's very unconvincing or uncompelling, when it's against.
Just because
One second. Let me just finish the line. Danan Sadi, that means this is a very strong umma. We are witnesses. I mean, we the world, right? Typically, right, if a person receives money from one and not from the other, the likelihood is that he received the money because he agreed to sell it to that person. Not impossible, that there isn't some other chicanery or consideration going on here. But in 9 cases out of 10, the person who gave the money is the person who he intended to sell it to. Umishani, that's why the Gemara gives the answer, Denokat Zuze Mitravayu. That, yeah, you're right. If he said, I sold it to Ruvain, even though he received money from Shimon, the Migu wouldn't work. But the case is not that. The case is that Ruvain and Shimon both put down money. And the question is, who did he intend to accept from Ruvain or from Shimon? Then the Migu should always work as long as
Why
it's
do we have to go so far? Why can't we just say that Shimon jumped the gun and put the money down before Ruvain had a chance to put the money down? They were having a normal transaction. Okay, Levi was selling it to Ruvain.
If
and
Shimon,
then as Ruvain went into his pocket to get his money,
no, they're assuming that if only one
throws
person
the money
put down, they're assuming that if only one person put down the money, then what that means is
Shimon definitely beat him to the punch. But that doesn't mean
right.
that
No, they don't mean beat him to the punch.
Or
They mean
in the process of making it a deal.
right. No, they don't. The case is not beat him to the punch.
It's a lot better to say that than to say that both of them put down the money.
Right. No, but the Havamina was that only one person put down the money, not beat him to the punch. It completely only one person put down the money. So what they're saying is, how likely is it that the person who didn't put down the money was the intended recipient? He didn't put down the money at all. That's what they're saying. But that's Tosas's view.
I mean, the only reason I question it, because remember, this is all happening almost in a nanosecond. The mocha is still holding on to
that's why.
Makes sense in an elongated transaction.
No, I understand. But that's why if there are two matan moses, even if they're not simultaneously, so it's very confusing. And then the question of who he intended and so on and so forth is very
because anybody could, and in fact, I'm wondering why the Gemara, why the Chacham were not worried about that. For example, we're worried about by a Aveda and everything else that somebody just jumps in. Okay, I mean, a guy is making a transaction in the street with somebody. He sees a wonderful thing, and the guy just throws the money in. We're talking a nanosecond. He's holding the
right. I'm just saying the first case where there's only the Lexis is in Manokat, there's no, it's not a timing question. There's only one person who gave the money, period. In the second case,
while he's still holding the thing in his hand.
So, all we're saying is that according to Tosfos, just let me sum up. For Tosfos, there is no yichus to a mocher, a chaya, a daya, and it's not a special namanas. It's the old, recognized, although somewhat controversial about its scope and nature, din of migu. But if it's a din of migu, so there are two limitations. Number one, it will never apply after the basis of the migu has passed. In other words, we don't care what he remembers. We only care what he says when he is in control. That's what a migu is. Otherwise, it's migu l'mafrei. That's limitation number one. For Tosis, there's a limitation number two. And that is, we say there are limits to migu. Ein migu keneged edim. But edim doesn't mean two witnesses only. It means a very strong, compelling umdana. So that's how he reads the Gemara. If he were to claim that he sold it or he intended to sell it, dafka to the person who didn't give him the money, that is not a credible claim.
Are there other cases where an umdana would be equivalent to two edim?
Sure. We call that anan, those kind of umdanas, we call them.
I mean, there are times when an umdana is very strong.
No. Let me make it clear. Not equivalent to edim that it can equal an edim when there are edim, but what we call in the Gemara migu neged edim or migu neged anan sadi.
In other words, if you have two edim on one side, umdana on the other side, the two edim are going to win.
Yeah. No, it's an expression. Migu keneged edim or keneged anan sadi means a very strong, very compelling umdana. That's what it means. Okay. So that's Tosis. The Rif had a different take. The Rif said, listen, the Tosefta says that the only time that you believe the mocher is when he's holding on to the object. But that applies in our Gemara and Bab Metzia too. So how do you explain Shnai Moks and Batalis? So the Rif came up with a very interesting idea, and that is the din of Shnai Moks and Batalis in the Mishnah describes the case of Metzia. But it doesn't describe the case of mocher.
The Mishnah talks about two cases, not just Metzia.
What?
Doesn't the Mishnah talk also about we have two cases of Shnei Mochsim Batalis. It's not just,
Shnei Mochsim Batalis. So the Mishnah says, the Gemara, the whole problem in the Gemara here is
Gemara brings up a second version.
What?
Not just I found it. The Gemara brings up a second version. I bought it.
No, Zeomer Kulashali.
In other words, it's not just
two cases.
It's also a purchase, no?
Yeah, the second case of Kulashali, the Gemara says.
So how could the Rif say that this is on Mitzvah, so it's different? It's
right, no. So the Rif says the way to read the Mishnah is Shnai Mochsim Batalis, Zeomer Ani Mitzasiya, Zeomer Ani Mitzasiya. That's one case. I mean, they're literally both holding on to the talis, and the case is a case where it was an object, like a hefker object in the street, and they're arguing who picked it up first. Then the rest of the Mishnah says Zeo Merkulashili. That's referring to Mekach Memkar, and basically it's referring to a case where the mocher is still holding on, and he's holding it for both of them.
That's little.
The problem with that is, by the way,
that's a little inventive.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, the Rambam, I'm just going to read you the Rambam just to show you.
That's a tortured interpretation of the.
Yeah. You're 100%, but it's a forced interpretation because of the problem. Namely, how could the Gemara say, ask the mocher if the mocher is only believed when he's holding on, if it's against Shnai Mosa. So if you put all the information together, they were forced to this. Well, the Rif was forced into this interpretation. One second. I'm just going to read you, this is the Rambam follows the Rambam.
Rambam follows this interpretation of the Rif?
Yeah. I'll read it to you. Listen very carefully.
Very unrational of him, but okay.
What?
And very unrational of him, but okay.
No, because of the problem.
I understand.
The Rif didn't blindly, Rif didn't say, this is the simple reading of the Mishnah. The Rif confronted a Mishnah, and then he confronted a Gemara that seems to be incompatible with the Mishnah, and he felt that the best solution was this interpretation. So, and again, the Rambam, the Rambam agreed. So this is Perek Chaf, Hilchos Mechira, Halacha Dal. Listen to the way it reads. I should have put it on the sheet. My mistake. Neman Balamekach, meaning the salesman, the seller, right, is believed, Lomar, to say, Lazeh macharti v'lazeh lo macharti, exactly our Gemara. He's believed to say, I sold it to Ruvain and not to Shimon, or to Shimon and not to Ruvain. A Masai, says the Rambam. When is that true, that we believe the mocher? Bisman shemekach yotze mitachas yodo. As long as the mocher is still holding on to it, and he hasn't given it up. Avalim ena mekach yotze mitachas yodo. But once he gives it up, harehu eid echad bilvad. Then he's like a regular one aid in a situation where you need two aidim. The dino be'edazu kedin kol adam shaharei eino nogea be'eduso. By the way, he relates to your question, is he a nogea b'davar? He says he's not a nogea b'davar. The Meiri considers he might be a nogea b'davar. I'll explain that in a minute, but that's what you were talking about before. Lefikach, therefore, well, before I continue, so you see the Rambam is describing like the Rif that the case is a case where the mocher is holding on to it, but then he adds, Lefikachim natal hadamim mishnayim, if he took money from both parties, but natal me'echad midaito v'echad bal karcho, one willingly and one forcibly, v'lo yada mimi natal midaito umimi natal bal karcho, and he can't remember. If he did remember, because since it's still in his hands, we'd believe him. But if he can't remember, because it's, complicated, bein shayamekach biyado, bein shayu shneim tovsin, whether or not he's holding on to it, or two of them, each is holding on to it, either way, it wouldn't help, because he doesn't remember. Ein kan edus klal, v'kol echad mishneim, nijba b'takanas chachamim, and nikitas chefet, v'notel, chatzi hamekach, v'chatzi hadamim. That's the Mishnah. That's the din of Shnayim Oksim B'talis Yachloku. But the Rambam says it can happen in two ways. It can happen either if the mocher is holding on to it, but he doesn't remember, right? That's also Shnayim Oksim B'talis Yachloku. Why? The answer is because he's holding it for both of them. Because each one is making a claim. He doesn't have the answer to the claim. So it's the equivalent of Shnayim Oksim B'talis. So this is
the rift. Does the mochen know or have an opinion as to who the real owner is?
We're saying if he received money from both of them,
But
and
does he
he
still
doesn't, then he doesn't.
So he's not even an Eid Echad. He doesn't know anything.
No, he is an Eid Echad, but the Eid Echad is not enough.
No, but what's he testify? He does know who he received the money from first.
Correct. He doesn't. Both of them both of them threw money at him, and he didn't get a chance. He doesn't
say
remember.
that Ruvain really gave me the money, and therefore he should be getting the object.
Well, he doesn't know if it's Reuven or Shimon. One of them,
So he's
he
not an
remember.
Eid Echad either. He doesn't know anything.
He's like an Eid Echad.
Eid Echad to what? He doesn't know.
Oh! I see what you're asking. Yeah. No, if he gave up. Let's say this. Sorry. If ein mikcho biyado, if he wasn't holding on to the object, but he remembered, he would be like an Eid Echad.
And if he was like an Eid Echad, he has no power whatsoever.
No, he has the power
Not
probably
to get a shvua.
Oh no one said he doesn't have the power to make a shvua. So that is an interesting question, right? We'll get to that in just a second. The simple reading of the Rambam is that he does have the power to impose a shvua on the other party, doraisa. But that's still not going to win the case. It's still going to be a
I may not want to swear, so it may help.
Okay, fine. But that's if he doesn't want to swear the shvua drabanan, he'll lose the case too, right? But I'm going to read that line again because you asked me about it. 1 second. If he's not holding on, harehu ke'ed echad bilvad. The dino be'edazu kedin kol adam shahare eno nogea be'edusa. If he's not holding on to it, he's an eid echad. An eid echad is mechayev b'shvua. Okay.
And according to the Rambam, the reason he's not a nogea b'dava because he's not holding on to it anymore.
No. The Ram doesn't think he's an Nogea B'davar anyway. It's the opposite. The Ram's saying if he's holding on
Reading of it sounds that since he's not holding on to it.
If he's holding on to it, then he is believed as a mocher, not just like an Eid Echad. He's believed as if we believe him completely. And if he remembers, then we'll believe him.
And
if he doesn't,
he'll be an Eid Echad even if he's holding on.
No, he's more than an Eid Echad. If he's holding on,
my question is: with the Rambam,
Eid Echad is limiting. We want
Rambam not be bothered by the fact that he's a Nogea B'davar so long as he's holding on.
The Rambam thinks that either way he's not a Nogea B'davar.
Okay.
He's not a Nogea B'davar, and therefore, if he's holding on, then we believe him completely. He's more than an Eid Echad. If he's not holding on, but he already passed it off to them, then he is an Eid Echad.
Every other Eid Echad.
The consequence of an Eid Echad is that he will impose a shvua. The Ram doesn't spell this out, but it's pretty clear. And the Ram seems to say this in Pirush Mishnayos and Bava Metzia as well. And that is that he will impose a shvua doraisa, a biblical shvua, on the other party. However, what we're going to get, the main thing we're going to get to if we get to it, is that probably the Ram doesn't hold like Rabbeinu Tam either. And even though the Ravid kind of, accused him, the Ravid accused the Rambam of thinking that if he is an Eid Echad, he will impose a shvua doraisa on the other party, and he will also absolve or exempt the person who he is advocating for from taking the shvua d'Rabbanan. That the Ram didn't say that. He just said he's an Eid Echad. He doesn't say anything about what we call Eid Echad HaMesayeya. I'm just going to read you the Ravid since we're here already. The Ravid says, Omar Avram ein devarav mechuvarim. He says, I don't agree with the Rambam. Mashma mechlal devarav, right? Deresha, right? Shehu meid ein sham shvua l'shneim b'nekitas chayfetz. Because it sounds like what he's saying is that if he was only an Eid Echad, that there wouldn't be a shvua d'Rabbanan at all. V'lo yadati lama. Ein din ze barur etzleinu. So the Ravid says this idea that an Eid Echad who supports one side, the side that he supports, he exempts him from taking a shvua, that is not something which is clear to me. And we'll see in a moment the Ravid, we'll see in whatever, the Ravid in his Hasagos on the Rif against the Balamor, is even stronger, as is the Ramban. So we'll get to that in a second. So the point is that Tosas has a certain take about Migu and Migu Danan Sadi. The Rif and the Rambam have a take to explain this Gemara that the Mocher is holding on, and it's not Shnai Mos and Batalis, and therefore we would believe the Mocher if only he were clear about it. And if the Mocher gives it up, so then he's an Eid. But the simple pshat of the Rambam is he's an Eid and he would impose a shvur d'oraisa on the other party. He doesn't say anything about Eid Echad. The Ravid was hypersensitive because he was aware, and that's what his comments in the Balamor are about, that there was this whole discussion connected to Rabbeinu Tam, and then the Maram Rutenberg, and then the Rush, and so on, that he was aware of the fact that all of this, that this Gemara triggered like a huge discussion about the status of Eid Echad Messiah, an Eid Echad that is supportive. So let me explain that. Okay, so
may I ask something, Rabbi, before you can? May I ask one thing? Sure. Do any of these commentators say that that this whole thing is fighting over a neshama, over a soul?
No, definitely.
That the two not okay. Thank you.
Just about an object. This is a monetary dispute. A monetary dispute. Yeah. Okay. So let's look for a moment at Tosfos in at the end of the Tosfos in Kiddushin. That's where Tosfos comes with this idea of Eid Echad HaMesayea in our Gemara Bab Metzia. So look, keep going in Tosfos and Bab Metzia, in Tosfos and Kiddushin where we were. Tosfos, he says as follows: Ach, everybody with me? Ulefizat Tzorach Lomar Shalayada Shemyada Havamrina and Disrat Salazet. Ach Bereish Bab Metzia. Everybody have that? Dav Beis Amud Beis. This is the Tosfos and Kiddushin that we were reading before. This is 3. It's a long Tosfos. 6, about not 10 lines up from the bottom of the page. If everybody has that. You'll see it's a parenthesis that says da base amud base. Everybody got it? Okay, I'm assuming everybody has it. Okay, so ach bereish bab metzia base amud base gabi shnayim osam betalis demuki lo begemara b'mekachom emkar uparech mekachom emkar nexi zuzi miman nokat upirish hasam Rashi kefishi taso dahacha. Rashi, I discussed it last week, and that's what you were referring to. I'm just going to mention it very quickly. Rashi in Kiddushin and in Bab Metzia is totally consistent. Rashi's opinion was that the reason that the Mocher is believed, not because of Migu, it's a special nemonus of a Mocher, Chaya, and Dayan. The Ran thinks it's only a Din D'Rabbanan. The Ran says, listen, you have to rely on these people because they have specialized knowledge, and their specialized knowledge is crucial. Meaning, if you're not going to believe the midwife to identify, who's the Bechor or which child belongs with which family, you can just imagine that's going to be a catastrophe. Now, just because it's necessary doesn't mean that it's legal, but sometimes,
like
at least
believing your wife about kashrus. Exactly.
That's a great mashal, which I also like to give. Rashi says in Yevamos, Adat Peches Amud Beis, the Gemara there talks about Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim, that a single Eid is believed in matters of Yisurim. So the Bali Tosas are like very hep to find, with a source for that. Like, how do you know Eid Echad is Neman B'Yisurim? Like, what's the source? So Rashi in Yevamos seems to say, you don't need a source. He says, is it conceivable that Eid Echad is not Neman B'Yisurim? How would anybody ever eat in anybody else's house? You're going to have everybody has to have a Eidim and Mashgiach, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon. It's not clear if the point is like certain things are necessary. It's almost like, we have a rule in the halacha that, if you can't have a halacha she'ein, or Gzeira, at least makes more sense than Gzeira. She'enat tzibur yecholim lamod bo.
It's only by D'Rabbanan.
Right. So is that like a Doraisa equivalent? Like the Torah wouldn't have imposed a certain standard if people couldn't live up to it. Is that the idea? Or more Rashi saying, it's inconceivable. It's like a Darchei Noam idea, like the Torah doesn't want people to mistrust each other. It's inconceivable that it wouldn't allow, people to, share meals with one another. And therefore, we may not know what the source is, but we know that there is a reason that you can rely
Is this the rice?
but in matters of Isur. It's not the
Rice,
cause, it's the indicator. You know what I'm
this is
saying?
one of those devices, I think Rav Soloveitchik spoke about this, where the Chachamim were given the right to interpret what
I'm not saying that there are such things. The Shvusim of Shabbos, according to some, and the Isur Malach on Chol HaMoed, and things like that, where the Chacham have license, like to fill in the blanks or to define things. That's not what I mean here. What I mean here is that the assessment of experts in the system is that it's inconceivable that the laws would be so draconian that they wouldn't allow people to trust each other in certain basic things. And therefore, that's not a heter, but it is a reflection or an indication of what is likely to be the law's perspective. Do you understand what I'm saying?
also explain why it's Naman B'Yisurin, but not by the Mamoneth?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so that is that the Ran says it. Now the Ran says it about it on a Darbanan level. I mean, the Ran in Kiddushin says you have to be able to rely on the midwife, on the judge, on the mocher, because they have specialized knowledge. And if we couldn't rely on them, we'd be up a creek. It would be very difficult. So midrabanan, okay, if it's only drabanan, that makes sense. But there's no indication in the Gemara or the Tosefta or in most of the Rishonim that this is a din drabanan. So I think it may be a different point, and that is, and a little bit rooted in Rashi, and that is, are people who have like like a greater responsibility. People rely on them more. They're in positions of sensitivity, and therefore, to use the language of Rashi, it's milsa de rami ale de milsa, meaning if I know that that I'm in a sensitive position and people are relying on me, so my awareness, my cognizance, my my sense of responsibility makes me pay more attention. So kind of Rashi in both in Kiddushin and in Bava Metzia says that that's the idea behind the mocher, the chaya, the dayan, etc. But Rashi has a huge benefit from this, and that is if it's really that this person, given his position, right, whether it's the Ran or Rashi, but let's assume my reading on Rashi, which is more fundamental for the moment. If this person has greater responsibility and greater or more acute awareness, because of that responsibility that people are relying on him in a sensitive area, etc. So that explains why, we accord him greater, credibility.
Could we not?
But one second, let me finish the thought. However, in addition to that, you might say the Bamedvar Mamurim Bisman Shemikol Biyado is more flexible too, because, and this is a little bit what Jacob, I don't know, when Jacob said before, we rely on him. We, just because he gave the object to us, all of a sudden we stop believing him. So that is more of a factor. If it's not Midin Migu and it's not, some Xeris HaKasuv, it's really based on his added knowledge, expertise.
Why is he any different than the
reliability, responsibility?
Why is he any different than the midwife?
No, he's not. Rashi's saying the same thing about the midwife.
Okay.
So basically, why should it be limited to Mikol Biyado? So for Rashi, it's more quantitative, meaning as long as the pressure is on, right, until I give up, if I'm the midwife and I haven't yet handed over the children and told them which was the Bechor and which belongs to this family, which to that family. So I'm just going to, be acutely responsible and cognizant, of who belongs to who. Once I give it up, there's a big sigh of relief. It's all history now. So I still might know better than other people, but a lot of the pressure, right, to come up with that, is gone. Same thing, the mocher, right? So soon until I hand it over to the lokeach, I have this immense responsibility, or the dayan, right? But once I do that, then it's a matter of memory, not so much a matter of proactive responsibility. So what Rashi's saying is, the highest level of nemanus is bisman shemikhabiyado or bisman she'omdim lefanov, etc. Because at that point, he's like holding, my words, I'm dramatizing a little bit. He's like holding his breath. He's like, I haven't done my job, or people are relying on me.
Laser focused.
The focus is very intense because it needs to be. But once, I've done my job and now they're arguing about it for other reasons, that's a second level already. So it's still true that I did have this extra focus and responsibility and awareness and specialization, etc. I'm still probably, superior to a man in the street, but there's a fallout, there's a fall off, there's a drop in the intense level of my reliability. So the Rashi says that's the pshat in the Gemara. What's the pshat in the Gemara? If you look at the Rashi in Kiddushin, same thing here in Bava Metzia. So he explains as follows. Again, remember the problem. The problem is if you say Shnai Mosa Batalis, so it's not Mikol Biyado. If it's not Mikol Biyado, why are you believing the Mocher more than anybody else? And if you're not, then we don't understand the Gemara. If you are, then what difference does it make whether, there are two monies or one money? So look at Rashi in Kiddushin just for a second. Rashi says, skip the first one. Bisman shemikho biyado. This is what I was talking about. Derami alei lemedak. He has an added responsibility, right, to be very careful, to be really very scrupulous, about identifying who's who and what's what. The there are even stakes. It's like a curse. Even if the mecher isn't complete, if he accepted money from one party, that's called a mishapara. Hilkach medak dayek. Therefore, he is motivated. He has incentive, more than a regular observer, right? It's his job and responsibility, and people are relying on him. And therefore, there's a more acute, reason to believe in him. I think it's a very powerful idea. Aval bisman she'ein mikcho biyado u'shnei mosimbo, and it's already the two people are fighting over it. At this point, it's not his problem. He knew who he sold it to, and he sold it, and it's done. Right? Sulo diek liskar. Like, he drops that burden. Lemishahu. Then the Gemara says, right? Havadai midkar dakir zuze deman kibel. He was focused. He still has, more information and more reliability than somebody else. So if it's not so complicated, there's no reason that we shouldn't rely on him, right? So that's something that he would remember. Zuzidiman kibel. However, once the Gemara says that he took from both people, that's already more complicated, and the stakes, the acuity of his need to be responsible is already gone. He's already, done his job in most respects, not his responsibility anymore. He gave it to the right person. Now they're fighting about it. Now it's this question of his reliability in terms of memory. So he has more, but he doesn't have the full package. That's Rashi. So it can be Shnai Mosa Batalis, and as long as there's only one payment, we can believe him. Unlike Tosa said it's Migu, unlike the Rif.
Going back for a second to the question of Eidech and Nam B'Yisurim and the foundation level, couldn't we say that it's basically a combination of a mega rove that became an umdana? In other words, statistically, a mega rove of single Adam tell the truth, okay? and consequently, that becomes an umdana, that if a single aid is going to
I
come,
don't even know if you know that. There is a certain nemanus. People have nemanus, they just don't have edus.
No, but my point is that we're trying to say how we have nemanus on one side, you have two aidim on the other side, and you have this thing in the middle for one aid. And the question is, why?
That's the main thing we're going to get to in a
Why
minute.
should we give him any status? So what I'm saying is that we give him status because you have a mega rove, an ultra rove. I forget the terminology that's used when you have a not just a row 52%, you have a 90%.
Aruba,
So now, if we look back, we see that when single people come to give edus, an overwhelming majority of them tell the truth. Consequently, that becomes an umdana of sorts, that a single aid has certain credibility because the historically single aidim. So maybe that's what gives it the. I mean, that would be a more logical reason why we would give a single aid. Now, then, when you overlap the societal needs for it, it
you
makes
sense.
Huh? Yeah.
You talking about an isurim though?
Yeah.
Yeah, could be. Could be. But again, in Mominus, where you have a higher standard, you're still, kind of left short. But
there you have also, because there you have a winner loser.
Yeah.
Isurin, it's basically
100%. That's absolutely correct. Okay. So so you have Rashi, you have everybody had the same problem. Everybody was contending the same problem. So, you have, it's so interesting, right? You have 4 basically solutions. You have Rashi's interesting solution, right? Which is to dilute
each solution requires you to be a little tortured in your
no, because it's a serious problem. 100%. If it was easy to solve, then we wouldn't be talking about it so much. So Rashi has kind of compromised the part that has to be in his hands. That's how he accommodated. The Rif compromised by saying you can have Yachloku in the Mishnah, even if the Mocher is holding on for both of them. That's not so simple. The Balitosis, compromised by saying, this is Midin Migu, but if there was only one person giving the money, that would be Migu Keneged Anan Sadi, and you wouldn't say it in that case, even though it's Mizman Shemikabyado. But so that's their solution.
Totus is forced to say that he got money from 2 people.
Yeah, no, 100%. But now the question is, how does Tosas read our Gemara in Bab Metzia, where it's not Mikol B'Yado, so it can't be Midin Migu. So that's where Tosas embraced the idea of Eid Echad. But not Eid Echad B'Surim, but Eid Echad B'Mamon. So look at this. Let's go back to Tosas. So Tosas says, Pirish Asam Rashi, Kapirish Taso Dahaka. Rashi is very consistent here between Kedushin and Bab Metzia. V'od Pirish Asam, Avagav Damar Perik Vaser the Kedushin Bisman Shemikol B'Yado and Onaman. Even though the Gemara says in Kedushin and the Tosefta says that once he lets go of it, he loses his special status. V'hachava Kein Mikol B'Yado, the Travayu Adukim Batalis. And here the problem in Bab Metzia is they're both holding on, so he has lost that status. Amai Parashe Mochanemon Omukminon Benoka Travayu Zuzi Mitravayu. Okay. The answer is we originally thought that he only got from one person, so we'd believe him even if it's not Mikol B'Yado, because he's still a bit of a specialist, even though let's say 50% of his, acute responsibility, focus, is now gone, but there's still something that remains. Okay. So how does Tosas? They don't like this whole thing. They don't like the Rif. They don't like the Rashi. How do they explain the Gemara in Bab Metzia? So this is the breakthrough. After all, the Kedushin you can read, the Tosefta you can read, but the Gemara in Bab Metzia, which is, Shnai Mochazin, and they don't like the Rif, how are you going to explain it? Because there's no migu. Lakach tzarich lomar. Listen to this. Hasam benexi zuzim imanakat klomar. Heichik tzani b'masnisin ze yishava she'ela b'pachos michatzia. Nishalamocher miman kibel amos v'leheva ke'ed echad liftar smi shesio shemisayea. Sorry. Meaning, what Tosas did, which was also Kiddush. Again, everybody had to scramble because of this, conundrum here. Putting these two sources together, is problematic, as we've discussed. So what Tosas says is, everybody else thinks, everybody else is focusing on the main point. What's the main point of the Mishnah? And what's the peripheral point of the Mishnah? Well, the main point of the Mishnah is that Shleim Bos and Batalas Yachloku, the disposition of the actual dispute, which is 50-50. But there's another peripheral aspect, and that is, yes, but each one has to take a Shvuah D'Rabbanan. So when the Gemara asks its question, and so on and so forth, all the other Rishonim think we're talking about Yachloku, because that's the main event. The Rebbeinu Tam says it doesn't work. But what does work is, the problem in the Mishnah isn't the main event, it's the peripheral event. Why does the Mishnah say that in the case of Mecher, both of them have to take a Shvuah D'Rabbanan? After all, if the Mocher, even Shelo Bizman Shelo Ein Mikol Biyado, if he, is definitively identifying either Ruvain or Shimon as the single purchaser, you're right. It's not going to help you on the Achloku side to win the case, because Eid Echad is not Neman, B'dinei Mamanis, and the special Neman Mocher, which is Midin Migo, according to Tosas, doesn't apply Bizman Shein Mikol Biyado. So there's nothing to do. It just doesn't make any sense. But there is something that makes sense in Bab Metzia, and that is who said that the Gemara's question is on the Achloku part. Maybe the Gemara's question is on the Zei Shava Shein L'Pokas Mechatzia, Zei Shava Shein L'Pokas Mechatzia. Says Rabbeinu Tam, let the Mocher be believed like a regular Eid Echad.
Is this in the
What does that mean? But here's where Rabbeinu Tam came up with the big Chiddush. And that's what the Ravid was referring to too. And that is, he wasn't just asking, why do you take two shvuah? Why does each one take a shvuah D'Rabbanan? Let the opponent of the Eid Echad take a shvuah D'Oraisa. That's what the Rambam says. Right? The Rambam, as far as I'm concerned,
based on a takonas D'Rabbanan that people shouldn't grab the things from the street from each other.
Yeah.
That's why each party has to take a shvuah.
Yeah, that's Rabbi Yochanan.
So it has nothing to do with anything else other than the fact societal requirement.
Right. But it's still what the Mishnah means, right? So what Rabbeinu Tam is saying is, if the Mocher is willing to say who, from his point of view, who owns the object, you shouldn't have to take any of those Shvuos D'Rabbanan. The guy who is opposed by the Eid Echad, let's say the Eid Echad backs Ruvain, Shimon should have to take a Shvuah D'Oraisa, not D'Rabbanan. And Ruvain shouldn't have to take the Shvuah D'Rabbanan because he has an
That
object.
would eliminate the concern that people will grab each other's Messiah?
No, but we're not concerned if there's an Eid Echad that helps.
We have a stronger...
we have partial evidence. Not evidence to win the case, but evidence to neutralize the Shvuah. So what Rabbeinu Tam came up with here, though, this is, as far as I know, this is the only Gemara in Shas that is explicit this way. They have other diukim that they...
I mean, somebody could give an answer. Maybe it's, a little bit imaginative. And that is that the reason that each side has to take the shvuah is because the takana was that I should not grab and, whatever. I don't know that there's somebody there that's going to be able to give testimony about me. So if I want to keep society from going amok and people grabbing things, I still need those...
That might be another reason to reject Rabbeinu Tam. But I hear you. But what Rabbeinu Tam is saying, what's important is there are plenty of Gemaras in Shas that establish that an Eid Echad kosher, not Eid Echad Embisur, but an Eid Echad kosher in Dinei Mamanis is mechayev the opposing party of Shvuah D'Oraisa. I mean, the Rambam starts, Hilchos Toin V'Nitan, by declaring that there are three Shvuos D'Oraisa. Three Shvuos Dayanim D'Oraisa, monetary Shvuos. One is Shvuos HaShomrim, one is Shvuos Moed B'Miktas, and the other is Shvuos Eid Echad. Now we're going to be discussing those three a lot, what the relationship is between them. Those are the three Shvuos D'Oraisa in monetary cases. So this idea, the Gemara says it in Shavuos. So I should really, maybe next week I'll add to the Marmakomos. The Gemara says in Masechet Shavuos, Kol makom sheshnayim mechayvin oso mamon eirechad mechayvo shvua. Whenever two witnesses have the effect of creating a chi of mammon, a monetary obligation, right? One witness is sufficient to trigger an oath, a chi of shvua. Now that, and then the Gemara explains what the makar is. The kol avon kol chatas hud eino ba. It said the Gemara pasuk says in Shoftim, ein echad, lo kam l'kol avon l'kol chatas. You need two edim. So the diuk in the Gemara is le'avon l'chatas hu lo kam aval l'shvua hu kam. Not for mamonis and not for onshim and not for karbanos, but for shvua and ein echad is good enough. But what the Gemara is, if for sure, speaking about, and in all of Shas, what we're discussing explicitly is that ein echad is mechayiv a shvua on the nitva, meaning the defendant. He has to take a shvuas nishba v'niftar to exempt himself from any kind of obligation. He has to take this oath d'oraisa. However, what we don't have explicit information about, and became very controversial, is if you have an eid echad not opposed to you, but advocating your side, supporting you, a supportive eid echad, does he exempt you from a shvua? D'Rabbanan or D'Oraisa? So this is so fascinating. Rabbi Tam's reading of this little teeny Gemara here, Alexis Uzimanaka, because of the problem that we just pursued.
Are we saying, for example, if somebody's modeh b'miktzas and he would have to swear, and an aide comes and says, one aide that I agree with him, he should not have to swear.
If it applies even to Shua D'Oraisas. Yeah, that's part of the explicit argument in the Rishonim that we're kind of almost out of time, so we'll have to pick up with this next week. But what I'm trying to show you also is an interesting phenomenon, how the interpretation of a few lines of the Gemara, can create or can reveal a source, and open up a discussion, that we are previously unfamiliar with, a very important discussion. Eid echad is mechayiv b'shvua, but is eid echad poter b'shvua?
According to the Rambam on the three cases, what are the source for the being chayiv b'shvua?
Say again?
In other words, according to the Rambam's three shvuas d'oraisa,
yeah,
what is the source for us to know that there's three shvuas d'oraisa?
So here, Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh, we'll discuss it. Is the source
because depending upon the level of what we have to ask ourselves: is the eid echad rise to that level that it should?
Right. Again, what the Rambam says, I'm just using as a convenience. No one disagrees with the Rambam about the three shvuas d'oraisa, but there are sources. The sources are Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh, which is one of the mixas. We'll discuss each one. Shows Shvuas HaShomrim. There's a parsha in the Torah.
No, because then one has to come up with a good reason why eid echad should eviscerate such a strong d'oraisa.
Right, but just remember, it creates a chi of shua. So this is our next point. There are, let me say it this way: there are those who interpreted Rabbeinu Tam, because Rabbeinu Tam really only speaks about our Mishnah, which is a shua d'Rabbanan. So there are those, like Ramban says, Rabbeinu Tam. If you look at Sefer Yashar, and if you look at the Ramban in Muchamos here, which we'll look at next week, Mir Hashem. So what they say is, this applies to a shvua d'Rabbanan. Maybe even only the shvua Mishnah, which is unusual, as you said, Shlei Kol Echad Tokif B'Taliso Shel Chaveiro or Mora Heter. Maybe it's only limited to this shvua Mishnah, or the Rishonim will say it applies to all shvuos d'Rabbanan. But will it even apply to shvuos d'oraisa, which are more substantial? Right? And if so, maybe what about another shvuas eid echad? What about modeh b'miktzas? What about shom? Maybe you can distinguish between the three. Right? So there were those who said that Rabbeinu Tam's halacha is limited, right, either to certain types of shvuas d'Rabbanan or to all shvuas d'Rabbanan, etc. But we're not coming up with a totally new idea that an advocate or supportive eid echad exempts you from a chi of shvua. Eid echad creates a chi of shvua, but doesn't exempt from a shvua. However, if you look at the Rosh, I'm just going to read the first line. I think I did last week also, but finally we're there. The Rosh on the bottom of page 2, right, says, Divrei Rabbeinu Tam, Yesh Lilmod, this is the Rosh Masechet Bamitzia Perek Aleph Siman Gimel. Divrei Rabbeinu Tam Yesh Lilmod, for the words of Rabbeinu Tam we can learn. Deidachot Poter Min HaShvua. The Deidachot doesn't only have the ability to obligate his opponent for Shvua, but he has the ability to exempt his, the person who he's supporting from a Shvua. The Hevi Ram Rutenberg, this is the famous Maram Rutenberg, Raya, L'Dvarav Midadorshinan, the Gemara that I just quoted before of Masachat Shavuos, which is, L'kol avonu kol chatas hu de'ein kam, aval kam l'inyan Shvua. That's the makar of the chi of Shvua Seidachad. But the Gemara doesn't say, the makar doesn't say anything about a chi of Shvua. It just says Shvua. So the Ram Rutenberg and the Rosh understood that it means Gelo miyatakra ben chiyuv Shvua ben liptur Shvua.
They're trying to explain Rabbeinu Tam?
They're extending Rabbeinu Tam and trying to explain the source for it.
200 years later.
Yeah. So the Ode Kal V'chomerhu. This is also fascinating. I'll stop here. Eza koach miruba, koach hamuchsak, or koach she'ena muchsak. Is it easier to create a chiyuv or to exempt a chiyuv in general? It's a much more complicated question.
That's a fundamental question.
Yeah. So, but the way they're saying it is, what they're saying is to create a chiyuv, you have to override the person's muchzakos. A nitva, I mean, it's my money, it's in the bank. You want to, or I'm innocent until proven guilty. You want to impose a chiyuv on me? You're opposing my muchzakos, with this as a nitva.
But
so this is the argument.
Eid Echad may take away that chazaka.
So 1 second. The Od Kal V'chomer, Eza koach meruba, says the Rosh. Koach hamuchsak or koach she'ein muchsak? Who's in a stronger position, the defendant or the person who's making, or the claimant? Heba Omer, says the Rosh, koach hamuchsak. I would think that the defendant is always in a stronger position because he has the status quo. He's innocent. It's his money. The burden of proof is on you to prove that he's obligated. And yet, imkain kal v'chomeru. So, and yet you can impose an echad can impose a shvua on the stronger, meaning on the nitva, right? Kishe'ed misayeh l'mi she'ena muchzak zokei kasamuchzak lishava. So kishe'ed misayeh l'muchzak kol shekain shifter renim in shvua. If he can impose a shvua on the stronger nitva, we'll have to see whether everybody agrees with this, on the stronger nitva, then can't he certainly exempt the nitva from the attack of the weaker toveya? Meaning, is it easier to create a shvua or to exempt a shvua?
Talking Deraisa now.
Deraisa. This is a whole Deraisa discussion. So I will continue with this next time. So I just so you should be aware. So the Rosh and the Maram Rutenberg in Rabbeinu Tam extended this idea that Eidechad Messiah is poter a shvua deraisa. And that's what Ravid thought that the Rambam was saying this too, even though the Rambam didn't say anything like it, frankly.
The Rosh really basically just carried forth his Rebbe's concept, no?
Yeah. The Rosh, the Talmud, and the Maram Rutenberg, 100%. The Mordechai quotes this also Talmud and Maram Rutenberg. But the fascinating thing is that the Ramban and the Ravid in his what's called Kosev Sham, where he has a sagos on the Balamor, and the Ramban in Milchamas Hashem here in Bamitzia on his asagos on the Balamor, strongly argue. They strongly argue. They say, not true. There's no such thing Eid Echad Messiah being poter. They have to answer these questions. So I want to examine this question next time. And it really goes to the heart and core about the nature of Eid Echad B'Shvua and the nature of a Chi of Shvua. Okay, so we'll talk about that, and then we'll, maybe I'll send in a few more Marmakovos about it, and then you'll see how it ends up, because the next topic is going to be Motiv Miktas and Shvus HaShomrim, and it's very lively discussion.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Okay, have a good night, everybody, and we look forward to continuing.
Yashar koach.